Emma. It is the beginning of January 2023 and I wanted to go over my Goodreads. This is a video that I do every year where I talk about my Goodreads experience for the year and I talk about my Goodreads goals for the new year. We're gonna look at 2022, my year in review, and we're gonna talk about some things that I noticed. I also have some stats that I culled really quickly from looking at this data previously. I'm going to screen record. We can see here that I've picked my new challenge, and first things first, for 2022 my Goodreads challenge was set at 75 books. I ended up reading 135 books. So I have set my 2023 Goodreads yearly reading challenge at 75 books again. So I did well surpass that in 2022, but I don't want to overextend myself. 135 books. It's definitely the most books that I've read since I've been tracking how many books I read per year, but it's probably the most books that I've read in a year ever. I don't know how to do this except to just go to the challenge and then go to your previous challenge. So looking at 2022, one of the things that I always like to look at is like stack of books, the way they have it put out here, and I like to look at it just to see like where the books I read fall. Sometimes it'll remind me of books that I didn't remember as well. There is one book that I read that's not on Goodreads, which is how I got the total number of 135. So just looking at this scroll of all the books that I read over the year, I just enjoy seeing them all together. I wish you could like make it wider so that you could have like 10 books in a row or whatever. But I counted from this scroll and 55 out of the 35 books that I read in 2022 were by Black, Indigenous, or person of color authors. So that works out to be 40.74% of my total reading in 2022, which I think is actually pretty good. I'm sure it's much higher than it's ever been before, and I would love in 2023 to see that get up to at least 50%. Over 50% would be great, but having only an additional 10% to read I think is going to be pretty cool. I also went through this list to look for a couple of different things besides BIPOC authors. So one was queer books. Now these are books that are either written by queer authors or have queer characters in them or queer themes in them. And out of the 135 books, I read 27 books with queer themes or queer authors, and that sits exactly at 20%. So I would also like to see this number increase, but I think like maybe 30% of my reading, almost a third of my reading, having queer themes would be amazing. And remember, these are all just from me thinking about them from memory. I didn't do any research except looking at the covers of the books and remembering the books that I read. I had only 8 rereads in 2022, which works out to be 5.92%. I read 18 nonfiction, which works out to be 13.33%. This is down, I think, from prior years percentage-wise. Maybe not book-wise, but percentage-wise, because I just read so many books this year. Mystery is my highest genre category, and this is me going through not every book that has some sort of mystery in it. So, for instance, not Monkey Beach, which at the heart is a mystery of what happened to our main character's brother, but a like mystery book, like an Agatha Christie book that is considered mystery and is a mystery. I read 29 of those types of books. 29 out of 135 means that that is 21.48%. So that is quite a large percentage of books in a specific genre. The highest kind of mixed genre, if we're counting, would be like general fiction, literary fiction, and romance. If we group those all together, I read 37 of those books out of the 135, which is 27.4%. Romance on its own, straight up romance, not including books that have romance in them, but books that would be categorized as romance. I only read 6 in 2022, and that was 4.44%. Sci-fi and fantasy grouped together, so that is kind of a grouping, is 25 books. That's 18.51%. And then horror was another big section of straight horror books. Again, this is not a book that I found horrific, but ones that would be labeled horror. So like Cli-Fi didn't make it in there unless it was specifically a horror book as well. I read 21 out of 135 books, and that comes to 15.55%. So just again, to recap that, mystery was my highest isolated genre. That's always the case. I read the most mysteries every year, 21.48%. Horror would be the next isolated genre with 21 books at 15.55%. And then sci-fi fantasy, a melding of those two, is actually above horror at 25 books, 18.51%. So those are like the little notes that I took looking at the scroll of the different covers that I had. I think if I go to my year in review, year in books, it's going to take me to 2023. Oh no, it's going to take me to 2022. Okay, so according to my year in books, I read 28,778 pages and 134 books. So add another 12 pages and one more book to that. The shortest book that I read was Chicago Beauty, the Wilhelmina Murder Series by Kevi. And the longest book, according to Goodreads, is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, which is a young adult book told in verse. So although this was 416 pages, which is quite a chunk larger than the normal books that I read, it was an extremely quick read with very little writing. My average book length in 2022 was 214 pages, and I think this probably tracks because I do read a lot of novellas, very short books. I read a lot of short stories, collections on audio, so that makes sense. My most shelved book was The Hobbit with like a gazillion, and my least shelved, which apparently no one but me has shelved it, is A Candle Regaining Strength, which was a independently published poetry book that I saw at my job. I don't really write reviews, but I did write a review for that poetry book because it is an independently published book, so I wanted there to be reviews on there for people to see. Then we get back into another format of looking at all the book covers that I read over the year. So this one has like places where star ratings could be, but since I don't give star ratings on Goodreads, there are no star ratings there. I also did write a review of the Wilhelmina Murders, the Chicago Beauty, because that is also an independently published book. So that's my year in review on Goodreads. As far as my year with Goodreads, I continue to enjoy Goodreads. I know it's owned by a very bad company, but I find that the interface to Goodreads is very simple and easy. It's easy to search books, although I think the search could be improved a little bit. I like that Goodreads opens with like your friends list. I like that it has recommendations. I like that it's easy to find the Your Books section where you can divide it between different shelves that you have, or the shelves that you create currently reading, want to read, and read, which are the three shelves that Goodreads provides you. So for my read books, I have every read book that I could remember ever reading. I put in when I started BookTube or when I started Goodreads and when I started BookTube. If I recall a book that I've read, I will add it on there, and then I list the books as I'm reading them. The currently reading section is the books that you're currently reading, obviously, and then the want to read section to me is I put every book that I see that I think of that I'm interested in if it's a book that I might forget. So a book by an author that I've already read, like an Agatha Christie book, will not show up on my want to read list because I know I want to read all Agatha Christie's books, so I'm not going to put it on my want to read list. But for instance, the last book that is on my want to read is Ghost Season by Fatin Abbas. I have no idea what that book is. I just saw it somewhere. It seemed interesting, and so I put it on my want to read list. My want to read list does not include my own physical TBR. My physical TBR is my physical TBR. I don't keep track of that yet, but I do have a recently acquired books project that I've been working on all throughout 2022. In 2022, I tracked all my recently acquired books. I wrote down when I acquired them, how much they were, if I bought them, if I found them for free, perhaps a vintage book or a book that I wanted to save or rescue, but that wasn't going to make it on my physical TBR. So I do have a list of all the books that I picked up in 2022. I am continuing that list for 2023, and I do think that part of my plan for 2023 is to go to my physical TBR and list all the books that I have there as well prior to 2022. But we'll talk more about that when I talk about my RAB spreadsheet, which will have my recap of 2022 and my goals and new add-ons for 2023. My want to read list is never books that I actually own. They're just books that I one day want to read, I'm slightly interested in, etc., etc. The only other shelves that I have on Goodreads are the years that I've been on Goodreads and the books that I read within those years, so 2020 to 2023. Those are just to keep track of what I read in those years and the order in which I read them. One of the things that I talked about in my Goodreads review, my Goodreads chat last year, was the idea of setting up Storygraph, because people love Storygraph so much. So this year I did go ahead and set up Storygraph. It was very easy. One of the things that I was nervous about last year and why I didn't want to set up Storygraph was because I'd heard a lot of rumors that you could ruin your Goodreads that way, but that was definitely not the case. Goodreads just has you download an Excel spreadsheet and then you upload that spreadsheet to Storygraph. But I will say right away, right off the bat, Storygraph is not as user-friendly as Goodreads. It's not as visually interesting as Goodreads, except for the stats. There are also other aspects of Storygraph that I haven't explored yet because I just did this week. There are other things I'm sure that are good about Storygraph, but so far my initial impressions are that Storygraph is not as interesting to me as Goodreads. Except, obviously, the stats. The stats are great. I don't like that it doesn't have your friend list on there. I don't like that there's no interaction with other people immediately. Maybe this is less of a social media style website than Goodreads is. If we go ahead and look at my stats for 2022, we can look at the full year. Of course, the stats are pretty cute. Let's look at the stats first. So the stats, I only read 133 books in 2022, but I think it's not counting the last book that I read during the year, which was Wide Sargasso Sea. I ended up marking that as read on January 1st, and so both Goodreads and Storygraph didn't like that and didn't include it initially in my year of books, so I had to go ahead and backdate that to the 31st, which is when I actually finished the book. Eventually Goodreads caught on, but Storygraph did not, and the same children's book that wasn't available on Goodreads is not available on Storygraph, so that's why it says 133 books here. This has me at 28,876 pages, which I think is 100 more than Goodreads. Storygraph did change a lot of the editions that I had of books. It's not worth it for me to go back through Storygraph and put the correct editions of the books that I have. I just don't care that much about Storygraph at this point, and I've worked too hard on doing that in my Goodreads, so since Goodreads is going to be my main book tracking website, I am just who cares? It's fine. I find it suspect that in Storygraph, every person that I've ever seen who has Storygraph says that like their largest part of their mood pie chart is reflective. So are all books reflective? I think Storygraph takes a little bit of liberties with that. My next highest mood is mysterious, dark, emotional, adventurous, etc., etc. I do, of course, like the pie chart, and I do like that if you click on that, you get to see which books they're categorizing as that, so that's kind of nice too. Pace, I mostly read a medium pace according to Storygraph. Number of pages, I mostly read under 300, which is true, 100%. And it's interesting to note that I only have two categories. I have under 300 and then I have 300 to 499. That's it. I wish they did an under 200 page count because a lot of my books would end up in there. So I'm not sure why under 300 is the lowest amount that you can have. And then it says that I read 18 nonfiction, which tracks on how much I counted as well. Really, it should be 19 because I did read that children's nonfiction. As far as biggest genres, it says that I had 29, and I counted that I had 29 mysteries too, so that's good. Horror, it says I had 23. I counted that I had 21. So some of those books Storygraph was saying was horror, and I was saying was not horror. Contemporary 23, literary 20, classics 16. Classics? That seems totally not true. I'm sure they're counting modern classics in there. Storygraph only says that I have 15 LGBTQ and queer books, but I counted 27, so they're probably not counting like smaller queer aspects of the books. I think I will maybe start tagging on Storygraph. I haven't decided what tags I want to add. And then in format, it says that I read 15 digitally, which I definitely did not, but they're probably counting some of those audiobooks that were subscriptions. It says that I have 11 audiobooks, which I definitely read more than 11 audiobooks. That would be an interesting one to go back and check on Goodreads. Most read authors, it says that I read Mary Roberts Reinhardt, which I read 3 books, and Richard Osman, which I read 3 books, which I did not. I only read 2 Richard Osman books, so there's something wrong there. I read 2 Shirley Jackson, 2 P.D. James, 2 Amistad Maupin, 2 BXXKmas. I only read 1 Gloria Naylor, so something's wrong there. I read 2 Stephen Graham Jones, and I only read 1 Kevy. The vast majority of these, I think except the last 2 books that I read in 2022 were imported from my Goodreads spreadsheet. It'll be interesting to see what changes as I'm logging them in Storygraph. According to my year wrap-up on Storygraph for 2022, I only read 132 books, which is very strange because I definitely read 135 books. I read 28,700 pages, which is 100 less than Goodreads tells me and 200 less than Storygraph, give or take, tells me. Books per month is an interesting look. They're not entirely accurate, but that's okay. Genres: mystery, contemporary, horror, literary, classics. This is saying that my longest book was 384 pages and my shortest book was 15 pages. You explored the work of 109 new authors, so authors that I hadn't read from before. 39 books that you read were part of a series. That's interesting because it is counting those short story collections. It says I didn't have any DNFs, which is not true. I did have DNFs, but I didn't mark any of them DNFs because you can't mark DNFs properly on Goodreads. So that is something that'll be interesting to look forward to in Storygraph in the coming year and see if I can mark my DNFs. And then it says 5 books I revisited this year. So some of the stats problems with Storygraph is definitely they're not counting my rereads correctly. I could go back and retroactively change all these things to make a more accurate 2022, but I really just don't care that much. I have a year to glance on this too, which is very cute, and then you can go back to your stats. Storygraph also has challenges. There's multiple challenges that you could do. You can set a page goal, you can set an hours goal if you read more audiobooks. I only set a books goal, which is the same as my goal over on Goodreads, and that is 75 books. I've read 1 book so far. Going back to Goodreads, I have set my goal at 75 books. I hope to read more than that, but honestly, if I slow down in my reading a little this year versus 2022, I'm totally fine with that. I plan on continuing to use Goodreads the way that I've been using it, putting my want to read shelf as books that just interest me and I want to keep my eye on, using my currently reading as currently reading, using my read books as read books. I do try to log all the books that I own if they're books that I'm planning on keeping. If I have read a book and I think I'm going to unhaul it at the end of the year, I don't mark it as own because I don't want to have to go through those books and change them up later. Still am not going to do star ratings. I still am not going to do reviews on Goodreads, but it will be my main avenue of keeping track of the books that I read each year. As far as Storygraph, I have been adding books and I have been updating them to a certain extent sometimes, like when I'm reading them, but I'm not going to be updating it as frequently. I'll probably just put them as currently reading and then mark them as read. I will go through in 2023 and make sure that the additions are correct for the 2023 books. I will be excited to see my stats and see how much more accurate my stats could be if I'm really categorizing them. Goodreads, I'm going to continue to use it. It's going to be my main form of tracking books. I'm going to be tracking books the way I always have, and then in Storygraph, I'm going to kind of find my way on how I'm tracking that. One aspect of Storygraph that I want to explore is the readathon aspect and the buddy read aspect. I think that that could be interesting to look into more in 2023. Those were some stats and some graphs and charts of my reading in 2022 and what I think of both Goodreads and Storygraph. Let me know if you use Goodreads. My Goodreads is always listed down below. I will have to add my Storygraph listed down below as well. Definitely friend me on both of those. I do like to keep up with what my friends are reading on Goodreads, and I hope to do the same on Storygraph. Add me if you follow people on either of those social media sites, and let me know which you prefer. Do you have both Storygraph and a Goodreads? Do you prefer one over the other? Do you only have one? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye!